In the chill of early September 1939, Europe trembled as thunder rolled not from the sky, but from the relentless march of tanks and soldiers. Germany's invasion of Poland had already set the continent ablaze. Yet, just when the Polish people thought they had faced the worst, a new shadow emerged from the east. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union, once thought a distant power, crossed Poland's borders under the cover of a secret pact that would forever change the course of history. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was not merely an invasion. It was a betrayal written in silence and sealed in secrecy. Two great powers, Germany and the Soviet Union, had agreed to carve an entire nation in half. For the Polish people, it meant that there was nowhere left to run, no ally who could truly help, and no corner of their homeland untouched by war. Imagine the confusion and despair. To the west, the thunder of German artillery. To the east, the red banners of the Soviet army rising over border towns. Families fled in every direction, uncertain which enemy was worse. Soldiers who had fought bravely against one invader now found themselves surrounded by two. The dream of independence, so fiercely defended since 1918, was collapsing before their eyes. And yet, beyond the battlefield, something even larger was at play. The invasion of Poland revealed the dark machinery of totalitarian ambition, the willingness of two regimes to rewrite borders, erase nations, and silence millions for power. It was a moment when the world learned that neutrality was an illusion, and that behind every handshake in diplomacy could lie a dagger. But this story is not just about armies and maps, it is about people. It is about Polish civilians caught between two brutal forces, soldiers who refused to surrender, and the haunting question that echoes even today: could this have been prevented? As we journey through this chapter of World War II, we will uncover the secret agreements, the political miscalculations, and the human tragedies that defined September 1939. We will see how the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not just a political deal, it was the spark that ignited a global firestorm. If you love uncovering the forgotten corners of history, the stories hidden behind official records and propaganda, then stay with us until the end. There is much more to reveal about how this invasion reshaped Europe and set the world on a path to years of conflict and suffering. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dive history stories that bring the past to life. Your support helps us continue exploring the events that shaped humanity one story at a time. As the Polish people watched their homeland collapse under the pressure of two mighty invaders, hope still lingered faintly in the West. They believed that Britain and France, their allies, their protectors, would come to their aid as promised. The ink on those guarantees was barely dry. And yet, in the desperate hours of September 1939, those promises began to fade into silence. The Polish government had trusted that the Western democracies would rise against aggression, that justice and honor would prevail over fear and politics. But the reality unfolding in London and Paris told a different story. In the grand halls of power, the British and French leaders debated, hesitated, and calculated. When Germany struck Poland on September 1st, both nations had declared war on Hitler within days, a move that suggested unity and resolve. Yet when the Soviet Union invaded from the east, there was no declaration, no mobilization, no outcry to match the magnitude of the betrayal. For Poland, it was as if the world had gone deaf overnight. The radio broadcasts that once carried messages of solidarity now spoke only of caution and diplomatic restraint. Britain and France had chosen a narrow interpretation of their promise, their pledge. They argued, had applied only to German aggression, not to Soviet intervention. To the Polish soldiers still fighting amid the ruins, this reasoning meant little. They saw it for what it was: abandonment wrapped in legal language. The West had turned its gaze away just as the second hammer fell. Warsaw, surrounded by German forces, still resisted with stubborn courage. believing that the French offensive on the Western Front would soon begin. Rumors spread through the ranks that the Allies were preparing to strike, that any day now the Germans would be forced to split their armies and relieve the pressure. But the days passed, and no offensive came. In France, along the border near Saarbrücken, a brief advance had been planned, but as the Polish front collapsed under the twin invasions, the operation was quietly cancelled. French troops stood still, their engines cold, while Poland burned. The soldiers waiting in the trenches could only listen to the distant rumble of artillery in the east and wonder why their nation had declared war in name but not in action. In Britain, public opinion was divided. Some voices in Parliament, like Winston Churchill's, warned that ignoring the Soviet threat would only invite greater danger later. But most in the government preferred to focus on the immediate menace of Nazi Germany, avoiding another enemy they were unprepared to confront. For the Polish leadership, there was nothing left but retreat. On September 17th, as Soviet forces crossed the eastern border, President Ignacy Mosicki and Commander-in-Chief Edward Rydzyk made their way toward Romania. They hoped to reorganize their forces abroad, to rebuild and continue the fight from France. Yet even there, the hand of diplomacy reached out to stop them. Romania, under pressure from Germany, interned them as soon as they crossed the border, enforcing international law but extinguishing the last hope of a coordinated defense. Inside Poland, chaos reigned. The East, once seen as a safe haven, now swarmed with Soviet troops. The West was crushed beneath German occupation. Caught between two powers, civilians fled through forests and along riverbanks, their paths lit by burning villages. Mothers carried children on their backs. Soldiers buried their flags to keep them from enemy hands. Priests prayed over the dead in makeshift chapels of smoke and ruin. The silence from the West grew heavier with each passing day. And still, the British and French governments remained cautious. Calculating, unwilling to widen the war, the Foreign Office in London argued that Britain's treaty obligations had been fulfilled. They had declared war on Germany. As promised, the Soviet invasion, they insisted, was an entirely separate matter. But to many observers, this explanation rang hollow. It revealed not only political timidity, but also a failure to grasp the scale of the catastrophe unfolding in Eastern Europe. By choosing inaction, the Allies sent a message that would echo for years. That aggression, when cloaked in diplomacy, could go unpunished. The Polish people did not have the luxury of political nuance. For them, the betrayal was simple and personal. They had fought valiantly, expecting rescue, and when it did not come, they faced annihilation alone. Warsaw continued to resist for weeks, its citizens building barricades from rubble, its defenders fighting street by street even as food and ammunition ran out. When the city finally fell, it did so with honor intact but with a deep wound that would never fully heal. Historians would later argue about whether Britain and France could have done more. Some claim that logistical constraints and strategic realities made any large-scale intervention impossible. Others believe that even a limited attack might have forced Germany to divert troops and buy Poland precious time. Yet, regardless of strategy, the moral weight of inaction remains undeniable. The West's silence as the Soviet armies marched into Poland set a precedent that would shape the war and the post-war world in ways few could have foreseen. Behind the political maneuvers lay a bitter truth. The balance of power mattered more than promises. Britain and France were still haunted by the memories of the Great War, wary of another bloody stalemate. Confronting Germany was already daunting. Adding the Soviet Union to the list of enemies seemed unthinkable. And so, they waited hoping the storm would somehow pass, that diplomacy might succeed where courage had faltered. But history rarely rewards hesitation. As the final days of September passed, Poland was no longer a nation but a battlefield divided by two empires. Its government was in exile, its soldiers scattered, its cities in ruins. Yet the memory of that betrayal would endure, not only as a tale of lost alliances, but as a warning about the dangers of complacency in the face of tyranny. The invasion from the east had completed what the invasion from the west had begun, and the silence of Poland's allies sealed the fate of a country that had once stood as Europe's first line of defense. As Poland was torn apart by two invading powers, the chaos of war quickly gave way to something even darker. Beneath the smoke of battle, a new kind of violence emerged, not against soldiers, but against civilians. German troops, having swept through the West, began to implement orders that blurred the lines between conquest and cruelty. Villages once full of laughter and daily life became scenes of horror as entire communities were uprooted, punished, and silenced. It was not merely the destruction of a nation's defenses. It was the systematic dismantling of its spirit. In the early weeks of the occupation, German officers justified their actions as military necessity, claiming that civilians were aiding the enemy or hiding soldiers. But soon, those justifications vanished, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. The campaign against Poland was no longer just a military invasion, it became an ideological mission. The Nazi leadership viewed the Polish people, particularly the intelligentsia and the Jewish population, as obstacles to their vision of a new order. And so, orders filtered down from Berlin that went far beyond warfare. They spoke of cleansing, of removing elements that did not fit into the racial hierarchy imagined by the regime. Within days, the infamous task forces, the Einsatzgruppen, followed behind the army's advance. Their role was not to fight but to secure territories, which meant identifying and eliminating perceived threats. In towns like Begosses and Wark, Jewish families were rounded up, community leaders arrested, teachers and priests executed without trial. The countryside filled with whispers of what these black uniformed men were doing, whispers that soon became screams. Even among German soldiers hardened by battle, unease began to spread. Many in the regular army, the Wehrmacht, were soldiers in the traditional sense, bound by a code of duty and honor, and they watched with growing discomfort as this operated beyond any moral or legal restraint. Letters from the front later revealed the turmoil within the ranks. Some soldiers wrote home about the brutality they witnessed, describing executions and beatings carried out not in the heat of combat, but in cold efficiency. Others confessed confusion. How could they be fighting for the honor of Germany, while such atrocities were committed in its name? Commanders, too, began to notice the growing tension. Reports reached Berlin that morale was faltering in certain units, that men no longer understood what kind of war they were fighting. Yet for the Nazi leadership, this was not a flaw but a test. They believed that compassion was weakness, and weakness could not build an empire. The friction between the Wehrmacht and the SAS came to a head in southern Poland, where General Udo von Warsch's units operated with ruthless autonomy. They burned villages suspected of harboring resistance, executed hostages, and terrorized civilians. Officers from the regular army protested, calling these acts illegal measures. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a seasoned commander of the German forces in the south, was appalled by what he described as undisciplined chaos masquerading as policy. He demanded that Warsch's men be withdrawn from the combat zones, insisting that the army could not operate alongside those who ignored every rule of warfare. But Berlin's response was silence. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, architects of the SS's power, saw these conflicts as proof that their methods were working. The SS was meant to be above the army, loyal not to military tradition but to ideology. In their eyes, the brutality in Poland was not a failure, it was a beginning. The extermination of entire communities was being tested here. refined through blood and terror before being expanded on an even larger scale in the years to come. In the occupied territories, fear became a weapon. Jews were forced to wear identifying marks, their homes and businesses seized, their synagogues desecrated. Polish citizens who spoke out or resisted faced collective punishment. Executions were carried out in public squares to instill obedience. The air was thick with despair, but also with defiance. Underground networks began to form. Teachers secretly held classes, priests hid refugees, and small bands of partisans began to organize in forests and ruins. For every act of cruelty, there was an act of quiet resistance, though the cost was always high. The psychological toll on both victims and perpetrators was immense. German soldiers, some barely out of their youth, found themselves standing guard as innocent people were marched away. Some turned their eyes away. Others hardened their hearts and followed orders. Over time, this moral erosion spread, erasing empathy, normalizing the unthinkable. The longer the occupation continued, the easier it became to believe that violence was simply part of the New World Order. Meanwhile, in the offices of Berlin, the machinery of oppression became increasingly organized. Files, lists, and quotas replaced the chaos of the early days. Killing was no longer spontaneous. It was bureaucratic. Trains began to transport prisoners to camps under the pretext of relocation. At first, even many within the Wehrmacht did not grasp the full scope of what was being planned. They saw only fragments of village emptied here, a convoy disappearing there, but those fragments formed a picture too vast and too terrible for most to comprehend. By the end of 1939, much of Poland lay under German control, its cities scarred and its people broken. Yet the true magnitude of the tragedy was only beginning to unfold. What had started as an invasion had transformed into a campaign of dehumanization. The cess had proven that terror could control populations and silence dissent. The Wehrmacht, for all its protests, would eventually be drawn deeper into complicity. Its officers fought to choose between conscience and obedience. And so, within weeks of victory, Germany had already begun to lose something essential: its soul. The discipline and pride of the army were being consumed by the ideology of destruction. The line between soldier and executioner was growing thin. In the fields of Poland, under grey skies heavy with smoke, the world was witnessing the first signs of a darkness that would spread far beyond its borders, a darkness that began not with bombs or tanks, but with the quiet decision to see human life as expendable. While Poland burned and the machinery of conquest expanded, another, quieter campaign began within Germany itself, one that revealed the chilling depth of the Nazi vision. Beneath the triumphant propaganda of victory and national renewal, Adolf Hitler and his closest advisors turned their attention inward. They no longer saw their mission as merely defeating enemies abroad. They aimed to reshape humanity itself. In the autumn of 1939, while the world's gaze was fixed on the war in Europe, Hitler signed a secret decree that would set in motion one of the earliest and most disturbing chapters of Nazi policy: the systematic killing of the mentally ill and disabled. It began with words that sounded almost benign. The program was cloaked in euphemisms: mercy, death; euthanasia, release from suffering. Doctors, officials, and bureaucrats were told that the state had a duty to relieve those who could not live useful lives. Behind these phrases, however, lay a much darker truth. The regime viewed certain individuals, those born with mental or physical disabilities, the chronically ill, or those deemed unfit, as burdens on the German people. Lives not worth preserving. To the architects of Nazi ideology, human worth was measured not by dignity or compassion, but by productivity and racial purity. Hospitals across Germany began to receive confidential forms from the Ministry of the Interior, asking doctors to report patients with incurable conditions. These forms were deceptively simple: lists of names, diagnosis, and ages. A red mark or a plus sign would seal a person's fate. Physicians who had once sworn to heal were now recruited to decide who deserved to live. Some complied willingly, convinced by propaganda that they were serving science and the state. Others hesitated, but the weight of authority and the fear of defying the regime silenced dissent. The program's headquarters was established at Tiergartenstraße 4 in Berlin, a plain office building whose address would give the operation its name. Action. From there, teams coordinated the transport of patients to specially designated institutions scattered across Germany and Austria, places like Hadamar, Grafenegg, and Hartheim. Families were told their loved ones were being moved for specialized treatment, often to improve their condition. In truth, these facilities were converted into killing centers, equipped with sealed chambers disguised as showers and crematoria to dispose of the bodies. At first, the process unfolded under strict secrecy. Buses with covered windows arrived at hospitals to collect patients. Locals noticed the strange convoys but were discouraged from asking questions. Within days, relatives received letters stating that the patient had died suddenly of pneumonia or heart failure, accompanied by a neatly typed death certificate and a standard condolence message. For the families, confusion soon turned to suspicion as they began to notice identical phrasing, identical causes of death, even identical dates. But by then, it was too late. The truth had already been buried in ash. This operation was not born out of chaos, but out of deliberate, calculated order. Every step from registration to transport to disposal was organized with bureaucratic precision. In this efficiency lay the true horror. Killing had become administrative. Meetings were held to review numbers, to assess progress, to refine methods. Reports spoke not of people but of statistics. The Nazi regime had found a way to strip away empathy from the act of murder, transforming it into paperwork, procedure, and policy. The moral consequences rippled through the medical profession. Doctors who once took pride in saving lives now found themselves instruments of ideology. Some rationalized their actions, telling themselves that these patients were suffering, that it was mercy to end their lives. Others recoiled, whispering doubts in private but too afraid to resist. There were rare voices of courage, a few physicians, clergy, and ordinary citizens who dared to protest. Bishop Clemens August von Galen, for instance, delivered sermons denouncing the killings, declaring that no authority had the right to destroy innocent life. His words spread through Germany, stirring public outrage and forcing the regime to pause the program, at least publicly. Yet even after its official suspension in 1941, the killings never truly stopped. The methods developed under Action T4, the use of gas chambers, the bureaucratic efficiency, the concealment behind language became the blueprint for something far larger and far more devastating. The test of mass killing within Germany's hospitals laid the foundation for the extermination machinery that would soon spread across occupied Europe. Those who had learned to operate gas systems and manage logistics in the euthanasia centers were later transferred to concentration camps, where their experience was put to use on an industrial scale. This was the moment when the moral line vanished completely. What had begun as a campaign to eliminate the unfit soon evolved into a program aimed at entire populations. The idea that life could be categorized, that some lives were more valuable than others, became the cornerstone of Nazi policy. It justified everything that followed. The ghettos, the deportations, the camps. The killing of the disabled was not an isolated atrocity. It was the rehearsal for genocide. The tragedy reached beyond those who perished. Families were shattered, communities silenced, and trust in institutions destroyed. Hospitals, once sanctuaries of healing, became places of death. For years after the war, survivors spoke of the haunting silence that followed the empty beds, the unanswered questions, the lingering shame of those who had known and done nothing. Within the grand sweep of World War II, this episode might seem small compared to the vast destruction that came later. Yet it marked a turning point in the moral collapse of the Nazi regime. It revealed how easily ordinary people, doctors, nurses, clerks, could become complicit when obedience replaced conscience. It showed that evil does not always begin with hatred or rage. Sometimes it begins with quiet paperwork, sealed envelopes, and signatures written in ink. And as Europe descended deeper into war, the lessons of Action T4 would echo far beyond Germany's borders. It was here, in the sterilized halls of its hospitals, that the ideology of death first learned to wear the mask of order. Here, the machinery of extermination was tested, refined, and normalized. What began as an experiment under the guise of mercy would soon consume millions, proving that the greatest dangers to humanity often arise not from chaos, but from the cold logic of those who believe they are building a better world. As the war in Poland entered its grim aftermath, the occupied cities and towns became laboratories for a new kind of control. The German conquest had been swift, the resistance crushed, and the land divided between two empires that claimed to bring order. But beneath this illusion of authority, another plan was quietly taking shape, one that would determine the fate of millions. The Nazi leadership, emboldened by their victories and their racial ideology, began to turn their attention to a question that had long haunted their policies: what to do with the Jewish population of Poland. It was in this moment of transition, when conquest turned into occupation, that Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most calculating and ruthless men in Hitler's circle, issued an order that would change history. Heydrich was a man shaped by cold efficiency. As head of the Reich main security office, he viewed people as categories, numbers, and problems to be solved. In the weeks after Poland fell, he drafted directives that would define the Nazi approach to the Jewish question. These orders were deceptively bureaucratic, filled with administrative language, but their intent was unmistakable: to isolate, control, and dehumanize. Jewish communities were to be separated from the rest of the population, removed from economic life, and confined to specific districts under strict surveillance. The official justification spoke of security and public order, but the underlying goal was to erase Jewish presence from German society and eventually from history itself. Across occupied Poland, the orders were implemented with ruthless precision. German officials marked off sections of cities, often the poorest and most crowded, and declared them restricted zones. In Warsaw, Hida, Krakow, and dozens of smaller towns, brick walls and barbed wire began to rise. Streets that had once echoed with the sound of markets and prayer were sealed off, becoming islands of despair within cities that continued to function just beyond their borders. Overnight, the Jewish population was cut off from the rest of society. Shops were confiscated, schools closed, and property seized. Families who had lived for generations in one neighborhood were driven into another, carrying only what they could hold in their arms. Inside these ghettos, life became a daily struggle for survival. Food was scarce, medical care almost non-existent, and disease spread quickly through the overcrowded streets. The ration system allotted far less to Jews than to other residents, a policy designed to weaken rather than sustain. Yet amid the deprivation, the ghettos became places of both endurance and quiet defiance. Teachers organized secret classes to educate children. Artists painted scenes of daily life as testimony. Religious leaders continued their rituals, even in hiding, as acts of faith against the dehumanization imposed upon them. For the German authorities, these ghettos served multiple purposes. They were holding areas, control mechanisms, and laboratories for a larger plan not yet fully articulated. To the outside world, they appeared as measures of wartime security. Inside the Nazi administration, they were understood as the first stage of elimination. Heydrich's vision was not one of chaos but of calculated progression. He believed that by concentrating the Jewish population into confined spaces, the regime could both exploit their labor and prepare for a final solution that would remove them entirely. This was not cruelty, it was logistics. Reports from occupied Poland soon reached Berlin, describing the success of the segregation measures. Heydrich and his subordinates studied these reports carefully, noting how many people could be confined, how much food was required to sustain them, how disease could spread to reduce numbers naturally. These statistics would later be used to design far more sinister operations. The ghettos became, in essence, a prelude, a controlled environment where the machinery of annihilation could be tested without yet revealing its full intent. For those trapped within, hope became both a weapon and a wound. Rumors spread of deportations, of camps farther east, of people who vanished and were never seen again. Yet still, many clung to the belief that survival was possible, that the war might end before the worst could happen. Parents comforted their children with promises of better days. Musicians played in the courtyards. Underground groups formed to smuggle food, medicine, and messages to the outside world. The human spirit, though caged, refused to vanish entirely. In Warsaw, the largest of all ghettos, over 400,000 people were crammed into an area barely 3% the size of the city. Every street became a symbol of endurance under oppression. The German soldiers who patrolled the walls saw only numbers. Inside, the residents saw one another, neighbors, friends, families bound together by shared suffering. Writers like Emanuel Ringelblum began documenting daily life in secret archives, preserving the truth for a world that might one day listen. They knew that the walls were not just physical. They were barriers built from indifference, designed to make the victims disappear from public view. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy in Berlin moved forward with chilling indifference. Heydrich's directives evolved into formal policy, endorsed by higher authorities who saw the ghettos as an efficient way to manage what they called the Jewish problem. What had begun as confinement was gradually transformed into preparation for deportation. Each transport of workers or prisoners was logged, each death recorded, each district report filed neatly into the growing machinery of genocide. The story of the ghettos is not just one of cruelty, but of the systematic erosion of humanity through administration. It was the moment when paperwork and ideology fused into a deadly precision. The walls that divided cities were built from bricks, but also from the belief that entire populations could be categorized and controlled. Heydrich's order did not arrive with explosions or speeches. It came quiet, through memos and signatures, through the calm authority of men who believed they were building a new order. By 1941, as the war widened and the Wehrmacht advanced deep into the Soviet Union, the purpose of the ghettos became clear. They were no longer merely zones of segregation. They were collection points for deportation to newly constructed camps. The ghettos that had once confined now became gateways to destruction. What began as a policy of isolation ended as a program of extermination. In retrospect, Heydrich's decision to concentrate Poland as Jews into ghettos was one of the most consequential acts of the early war. It institutionalized segregation, normalized cruelty, and trained an entire administration to view human life as a logistical problem. From that moment, the path to the Holocaust was no longer theoretical, it was already being paved. One brick, one wall, one sealed street at a time. The people who lived and died behind those barriers became the first victims of an ideology that would soon engulf an entire continent, proving that genocide begins not with mass violence, but with silence, bureaucracy, and the quiet acceptance of injustice disguised as order. as the fires of war spread across Europe and the Pacific. A lesser-known battlefield far to the east quietly determined the fate of nations. In the summer of 1939, while Germany and the Soviet Union prepared to divide Poland, another conflict unfolded on the remote steppes of Mongolia, a place few in the West had even heard of. There, on the banks of the Khalkhin-Gol River, Soviet and Japanese forces clashed in a brutal and decisive struggle that would alter Japan's course and reshape the future of World War II. The battles at Khalkhin-Gol were fierce, chaotic, and unforgiving. Japanese troops, driven by ambition to expand into Siberia, believed they could easily crush Soviet resistance. But they underestimated the strength and strategy of General Georgy Zhukov, a rising commander who would later become one of the greatest Soviet generals of the war. Zhukov's use of tanks, artillery, and coordinated assaults revealed a new kind of warfare: swift, relentless, and devastating. When the dust settled, Japan had suffered a staggering defeat. Thousands of its soldiers lay scattered across the Mongolian plains, and its dreams of northern expansion, the idea of seizing Soviet territory, were shattered beyond repair. The consequences of that defeat stretched far beyond the battlefield. For Japan's leaders, Khalkhin-Gol was a harsh lesson in the dangers of confronting the Soviet Union. Within months, Tokyo shifted its gaze southward, toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Rubber and iron, the materials needed to fuel its empire, could be found there, not in the frozen north. This change in strategy would eventually bring Japan into direct conflict with Western powers, most notably the United States. Without Khalkhin-Gol, the attack on Pearl Harbor might never have taken shape in the same way. For the Soviets, the victory carried enormous strategic weight. It secured their eastern frontier, just as the storm clouds gathered over Europe. When Germany invaded Poland and later turned its attention westward, Stalin could be confident that Japan would not strike from behind. This allowed the Soviet Union to shift its focus and its armies toward the looming threat of the Nazis. When Hitler eventually betrayed the pact and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it was the very divisions freed from the East that helped defend Moscow in the darkest days of the war. In this way, the outcome of Khalkhin-Gol rippled across continents, silently shaping the fate of millions. It is a reminder that history often turns not on the grand declarations or the famous battles we know so well, but on moments fought in the margins, in places where few were watching. The dusty fields of Mongolia may seem far removed from the fall of Warsaw, the ghettos of Poland, or the decisions made in Berlin and Tokyo, yet they are part of the same story. The defeat of Japan in 1939, the division of Poland that same year, and the unfolding brutality of Nazi policies were all threads of a single, vast tapestry, one that would soon engulf the entire world. By late 1939, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. Germany's power was growing, the Soviet Union had expanded westward, and the Western allies, bound by hesitation and uncertainty, had yet to act decisively. The lessons of Poland, of Heydrich's ghettos, of the early atrocities and betrayals, all pointed toward a grim truth. The world had entered a new age of total war, where diplomacy and morality had given way to domination and fear. And yet, even in that darkness, moments like Khalkhin-Gol offered glimpses of what was to come. The tactics and leadership that Zhukov displayed would later define the Soviet defense against Germany. The lessons learned by Japan would guide its decision to strike south, setting in motion the Pacific War. The alliances, betrayals, and strategies that emerged in 1939 would echo through the next 6 years of conflict, shaping not only who would fight, but who would survive. Looking back, it is astonishing how a single year, 1939, could contain the seeds of so much. It was the year that began with uncertainty and ended with the world divided. It saw the rise of ideologies that claimed millions of lives, the collapse of nations, and the first signs of the global struggle that would define the 20th century. It was a year that taught humanity the cost of silence, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the fragility of peace built on fear. As we close this chapter of history, we remember not only the soldiers and civilians who perished but also the countless choices made in offices, on battlefields, and in quiet corners of occupied cities that shaped the world we live in today. The invasion of Poland, the rise of the ghettos, the first acts of state-organized murder, and the distant victory at Khalkhin-Gol all were warnings, each revealing how power without conscience leads to devastation. History is not just about the past, it is a mirror held up to our own time. Every generation faces its own crossroads, its own choices between truth and indifference, compassion and cruelty. The stories of 1939 remind us that the decisions we make or fail to make can alter the course of history itself. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next deep exploration into history's forgotten chapters. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life, stories that remind us that understanding the past is the first step toward building a wiser, more compassionate future.